You've picked a fly, made a cast, and you've got a fish on the line. Now what do? Is there some sort of mantra to chant while you reel it in? A magic spell to calm your nerves? It might feel that way sometimes, but fighting and landing fish on a fly rod is a lot simpler than you might expect. Once you understand how to use the rod and reel to gain a bit more control over the fish, you will have a lot fewer stories about the big one that got away. This week on Untangled, I'll walk you through the basic skills you need to understand to fight and land more fish on a fly rod.
This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co.
Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant, having more fun than a human being ought to be allowed to have, but someone's got to do it, so I humbly volunteer myself. I'll do the job. I hope everybody's doing well today. Thanks for joining us. I want to go ahead and set two expectations right from the start of the show, because doing this is going to help contextualize what we're talking about today, which is fighting and landing more fish on a fly rod. So, expectation number one, you are not going to catch every single fish that you hook. I don't care how good you are at fly fishing. It just doesn't happen. You don't catch 100% of the fish that you hook. All right. The best anglers that I know still lose fish. Granted, they lose a lot fewer than I do. I'm losing them left and right over here. But there's no way that you're going to put every single fish that eats your fly into the net. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. Your tippet could get nicked on a rock and snap. The hook set could just not be as good as it possibly could be. You could even have a bad piece of leader that's got a weak spot in it and it just snaps, and that's no fault of your own. There's a lot of things that'll happen it's not your fault. It's just reality, what we do. Okay, there's things that go wrong that you don't have any control over. So you are not going to hook and land every fish. Okay, if you're willing to accept that, then the tactics that we're going to talk about today are a lot easier to absorb. This isn't about catching everything. This ain't Pokemon. All right. It's about upping your chances of catching more fish, which is our goal. And then the last expectation is that when you're fighting fish on a fly rod, you're not fighting them in the sense of how you fight fish on conventional tackle, spin cast, and bait cast gear. Because with that stuff, you've got a much stiffer rod and usually a lot heavier line. You've got usually much larger lures and hooks. So you've got a little bit more control over that fish. You've got more strength in your rod and line. You can kind of horse the fish in a little bit. I'm not saying there's no finesse involved with that, with conventional angling, because there 100% is, but you have a little bit more leeway to really put the hurt on the fish, horse them in, and fight them and get them to where you want them to be. In fly fishing, it's a little different. In fly fishing, you're not fighting the fish so much as you are trying to tire it out a little bit, not completely, tire it out just enough that you can then guide it to the net. So fly fishing, you want to think of it as you're guiding the fish to the net instead of fighting them. Now, we use the terms interchangeably because everybody's familiar with the term of, well, we're going to fight fish. But in fly fishing, it's just a little bit different. So if you understand those two differences, it really is going to make a difference in how you absorb this information. And speaking of this information, I'm going to go ahead and walk y'all through a story about a fish I caught recently. Gonna go through how I fought and how I landed this thing. And then I'll go back through, once we're done telling the story, I'll point out the principles that I used, and we'll go into detail on those fighting and landing principles. So about a month ago, maybe a little bit more than a month at this point, Alex runs the media side of VFC with me, doing all our YouTube videos together. We were up on this Spring Creek. We were actually filming some content for all y'all. It's going to be coming out soon. That's all I'm allowed to say right now. It's very hush hush. It's going to be cool, but we got to keep it on the DL. But it was towards the end of the day, and we'd wrapped up filming all the really important stuff. And Alex was just grabbing some drone shots, some of the scenery shots, and I didn't really want to work. So I just took the chance to go around the corner and fish for a minute because we had stopped right before this run that always has a good fish in it. And I've hooked and lost a fish in this run that's huge. I don't know how big because I haven't gotten a good enough look at it, but it's broken me off multiple times. So, of course, it's got to be at least a 50-pound trout down there. This spring creek's full of cutthroat trout, and it's at like almost 9,000 feet above sea level. So the fishing season on it is pretty short, and I like to take advantage of being on it whenever I can. And there's a few caddis coming off, but it was mostly smaller mayflies that were hatching. And I just had a dry dropper rig on. It's my favorite way to fish. And once I walked up to this run, I could see a really big fish moving, and he was eating nymphs just under the water's surface. He was sitting in a riffle, so the water was moving at a decent clip, but you could see him darting left to right. You'd see its mouth opening, just chomping down on whatever he was eating. So I took a minute, and I planned out my cast because I wanted to make sure I could land my flies a few feet ahead of him so that my nymph would have enough time to drop into where it was feeding instead of just zipping over the top of his head. Because if it does that, the fish doesn't see it and he's not going to be able to eat it. So I planned out how I wanted the cast to go. I stripped the line off my reel, make the cast, and I kept my eyes on the fish. I didn't really pay attention at all to my dry fly. I just lasered in on that fish. And this is one of the few, and I need to stress that, one of the few moments when I make a plan out on the river and it actually goes according to plan. It's very rare that happens. I'm not some kind of fly fishing wizard here, but it worked, okay? I threw that cast, kept my eyes on the fish, and he shoots right over to my flies, opens its mouth, and my dry fly twitched for just a second. I could see it out of the corner of my eye. So I set the hook, and I kept my rod tip nice and high in the air, and I immediately put tension on that fish. So as soon as it ate, boom, tension goes onto that fish. That same kind of tension, if you see me at a buffet or something, we lock eyes over the shrimp counter. Yeah, you know it's about to go down. There's this unspoken gauntlet that has just been thrown down, and we're gonna do it. We're gonna see who can eat the most, right? That same thing. Put that tension on the fish. Make it a little uncomfortable. So I set the hook, rod tips high, put tension on the fish, and all of the slack line that I had was below the reel. And I kept my line tight by clamping the line under the fingers gripping the rod's cork. So I always have line underneath, usually my middle finger that's on the hand holding the cork of the rod. So as soon as I hooked this fish, he wasn't happy. So he takes off for the opposite bank, like me trying to beat Alex to the soda fountain when we're stopping to get drinks on one of our trips. And I let the line slide through my fingers a little bit, just a little bit of tension on it because the fish was making such a big run. So I quickly reeled in all of my slack because it was very clear that the fish wasn't going to come in easy. So the fish is taking line. I'm holding it still in my fingers. I'm letting it run through, but I'm putting just a bit of tension on it while I'm reeling in all of my slack at the same time. Now, that fish tried to wrap itself in some branches and some roots on the far bank. So I kept tension on my rod, but I turned my rod to the side. So I had the bend of the rod pointing away from where the fish was trying to go. And that fish liked that about as much as I like broccoli. So it jumped clean out of the water to let me know, hey, this is not acceptable, buddy. Well, I didn't yank on my rod or my line when it jumped. I just slightly lowered my rod arm, just barely. And when the fish landed back in the water, it charged off again. And now at this point, I had all the line on the reel. There was no slack line. So the drag engaged. It starts screaming. So I tightened it just a hair, just a little bit. And then I went back to using that side pressure to utilize the strongest sections of the rod, which are going to be the butt sections, to try and help guide the fish to where I wanted it. So I actually started walking towards the fish. I'm reeling in line as I'm walking towards the fish. I'm continuing to guide it, trying to get it downstream out of that riffle it was in and into some slack water of the pool that's right below this riffle. And the fish finally gave in after a few minutes of tussling, but it turned and it swam straight at me. So I reeled line in like crazy. I keep my rod tip super high. I'm like, crap, thinking I'm going to lose the fish. And I just kept as much tension on the line as I could, trying to reel in as much slack line as possible. And then as soon as that fish got into the pool, it sees me and pulls a U-turn and shoots back up river. So I moved my rod back to that side pressure angle. The fish felt tired at that point, so I started to lift just a little bit. I wanted to get the fish's head as high in the water as possible. And once its head broke the surface, I shot my net out underneath its head, lifted, and boom, put an 18-inch rainbow cutthroat hybrid into the net. Call them cut bows. If you've ever heard that term before, that's what it refers to. So that was the rodeo that I went through, and I'm sure you picked up on some of the skills that I talked about, but let's go back through and go through all of them one by one.
Hey there, it's Alex. You ever find yourself standing in the river, staring at your open fly box, wondering, what the heck do I tie on? Yeah, it happens to all of us, especially if you're not quite sure what bugs are active. That's why we've put together our year-round hatch chart. It breaks down the major hatches that happen across the US so you can understand what's happening in your neck of the woods and pick the right fly with confidence. Snag a free copy by scanning the QR code on the screen or hit the link in the show notes. All right, back to Untangled.
Skill number one, and this might be the most important, but it's keeping tension on the line. I mentioned that quite a few times in that story. But by far, the biggest reason that you're going to lose fish during a fight is because you're not keeping enough tension on the line. If you don't keep tension on your line, that hook is just going to slip right out of the fish's mouth. Even a barbed hook will do that because tension is what keeps it right locked into the fish's mouth. Now, the whole reason that as beginners you're taught the keep the tip up when you hook a fish is a reminder to keep tension on the line. So you don't want the line so tight that the fish can't move at all, because that's when you'll end up snapping your leader. Okay. You just want a nice firm connection to the fish that gives you some measure of control over where the fish goes and how quickly it gets there. That's what you're looking for. It's a balancing act. It's something you'll learn and you'll get a feel for as much as you do it, or the more that you do it. But you want tension on the line, and you want enough that you feel like you've got some control over where that fish is going. Now, to get this tension, I'll do it in two ways. First thing is I always, and I can't stress this enough, make sure all of your slack line is below the reel, because if a fish eats your fly and you've got a giant pile of slack in between your hand and the first guide on your rod called the stripping guide, if there's a giant pile of slack right there, you are not going to set the hook on the fish very well. And if you do, it's going to sting it for 2 seconds and then pop right out. And that's one of the frustrating things I see beginners struggle with, is they've got all this slack line above their reel between them and their fly. You don't want that. You want all the slack line below your reel. You don't want it between you and the fly and the fish, because that's just going to create problems. Okay. Then the other thing that I'll do is I'll always keep the fly line tucked under one of the fingers on my rod hand, so that when a fish eats my fly, all I've got to do is clamp down on the cork grip and then lift my rod to set the hook, because that's going to keep the line tight. It's going to drive that hook point home. That gives me plenty of tension on the fish. It just helps me really work through that. And if you're watching the video podcast, you've gone ahead and you've seen an example of that, where I've gone ahead and set that hook, and you can see the fly line staying right where it needs to, right gripped hard against the cork of the rod. So that is your skill number one. Make sure you keep tension on the line. It's going to be your best friend. Skill number two is all about using your rod to put some pressure on the fish, and then using that rod at the correct angles. So if you keep your rod tip sky high, you're going to lose a lot of fish. If all you do is keep the rod tip sky high and then try and strip line in, or try to put it on the reel immediately. Now, I'll get to putting it on the reel in a minute, but we really got to dive into the angles and the rod pressure for a second. Now, a couple of times, in that story, I talked about side pressure during the fight. What that means is instead of my rod being vertical in the air, straight with the tip up, instead of that, I turn the rod so that it's horizontal. I want the bend of the rod. So the rod, when you turn it on its side, it's going to bend. And I want the bend of the rod to be pointing the opposite way the fish is swimming. What that does is it engages the strongest part of the fly rod, the butt section and the midsection. And that gives you all the strength to pull and to lift so you actually have that control over the fish. If you're fighting the fish with your rod tip straight up in the air, the only part of the rod that's actually doing anything to exert pressure on the fish is the tip. And the fly rod tip is the skinniest, weakest part of the rod. Its job is to protect your tippet and to help your cast come down and lay nice and soft on the water. That's the job of the tip section. It is not the lifting and pulling part of the rod. That's the butt sections and the mid sections. Okay. So once you've got a fish hooked, it is a great idea to use the rod to apply some side pressure, because this is going to let you start to guide the fish towards the net. And that's our whole goal. And if you're watching the video podcast, I've got some B-roll of that going where you can actually see the side pressure being used. That rod's not straight up in the air. It's horizontal. It's side to side as we're able to move these fish towards the net. Now, you don't need to switch the rod side to side a bunch like a ninja in the middle of the fight. You might see anglers on YouTube or Instagram do that. They move the rod a lot. You don't need to do that. You need to move the rod when the fish moves, okay? So if the fish takes off and you've got to change the angle a little bit, then do that. But you want the bend of the rod pointing downstream. And that's really all you've got to worry about. As long as you can do that, you're going to be in good shape, because you're utilizing the strongest part of the rod to really let that fish know that, hey, I'm in charge here. I am the captain now. All right. That's what you want the fish. You want the fish to have that feeling. All right. So that's skill number 2. Skill number 3, putting it on the reel. Okay. Putting it on the reel when the fish demands it. That's the key. And we get this question. I don't know how many times we'll get this question from beginners. But when do I put the fish on the reel, or when do I strip line in? Well, it's up to the fish more than anything else. You can do it however you want, but the fish really does dictate whether you need to put all the line on the reel or whether you can just strip the line in. Okay. This fish that I described in the story was a little bit unique because once it jumped, it took line and it shot off across the river. Even bigger fish like this, it was an 18-inch fish, so it was a very good sized trout, but even bigger fish like that don't always take a ton of line. You don't always need to put a bigger fish like that on the reel. Usually you will, but sometimes you don't have to. Okay. When fish start to make big runs like this one made, when they make it clear that, hey, I'm cruising and you're along for the ride, that is when I go ahead and I put them on the reel. And all that means is that I go ahead and I reel in all my slack. I'm still controlling the line that the fish is taking by keeping it pressed in between the fingers on my rod hand so that it's not just free spooling. There's still a little bit of tension, but I'm reeling all that slack line in. And then once all my slack line is reeled in, I can let go of the line with my rod hand, and I can just focus on using the drag of the reel itself to add tension and make it tough for the fish to run away. I personally don't keep my drag cranked down super tight. If your drag is too tight, when the fish go to run, they'll pull so hard and they'll strain so hard that you'll end up snapping a lot of tippets and leaders, and you're going to end up losing a lot of big fish that way, and it's very frustrating. And that goes true for how tightly you're holding your line against the cork grip. It needs to be able to move. If it doesn't move, there's a very good chance you're going to break the tippet off on that fish, and then you're just going to be frustrated. Nobody wants to be there. So it does need to move a little bit, okay? What you want to do with the drag is you want to set it to where the fish has to work, where it definitely is expending energy to move, but it's not impossible for that fish to move. Now, there are instances when you don't want the fish to move at all. Like if it's heading straight for a giant root tangle and you can see it. At that point, you want to clamp down really hard and pull and just hope that you don't break the tippet and leader at that point, because if it gets into the root ball, you're losing the fish. So those would be the very few instances when you don't want it to move at all and you just clamp down and pull and hope. Pull and pray, okay? But most of the time you want that drag set to where, yes, they've got to expend some energy, but it's not a whole ton that they're expending, or it's not impossible for them to move. Okay. Once you've got that fish on the reel, then I'll just use the reel to retrieve my line unless the fish runs at me or I need to retrieve line quicker than what the reel allows me to do. At that point, then I'll just go ahead and strip line in again. When the fish make a big run directly at you, you can reel like crazy like I did to keep tension on it, or you can just start stripping line in. It really just depends on how you feel most comfortable with getting a lot of line in quickly. I usually strip line in because it's quicker. You can just get more in than you can on the reel. But then when the fish turns around, when they've finished running at you and they turn around to go somewhere else, that's when I'll go ahead and I'll reel that slack line back in and put them back on the reel. So if the fish makes big runs, if it's clearly going and wants to throw hands with you, put them on the reel. But a lot of your smaller fish, your 10 to 15 incher trout, you can strip those all in. You set the hook, strip, get them close to the net. You don't need the reel for a lot of those, and that's why your reel, really is just a fancy line holder for a lot of trout fishing, because you're not going to engage the drag on a majority of the fish that you're catching, unless you're always catching 20-inch trout or something like that. So that covers the reel. That's skill number 3. Skill number 4 is not freaking out when the fish jumps. I didn't freak out when this big one jumped. And fish are going to jump. That's part of the fun of hooking them, is watching them catapult through the air. It's really cool. But I've also heard from some beginners that a fish jumping is the point in the fight when they seem to lose fish the most. So when this fish jumped on me, what I did was I just slightly lowered my rod arm. So instead of keeping it as high as I did, I just lowered it just a little bit. Because what I wanted to do is keep a little bit of tension on the line when the fish was airborne, but not a ton, because once that fish gets back into the water, it's going to swim hard, either in a different direction or for another jump. And if you yank really hard on the rod when they jump, that's going to put a ton of tension on that line. So when they get back into the water, that line is super tight. So then their next move, which is going to be a very jerky, very sudden move, can put a lot of strain on your gear, and it can pop the hook free, you can break stuff, okay, because you put too much tension on it when they were jumping. So when they jump, if you just lower your rod arm just slightly, just introduce a tiny bit, and I can't stress the tiny enough, a tiny bit of slack into that equation, then once that fish goes back into the water, there's enough slack to absorb the shock of whatever move it makes, whether it's another jump, it's running upstream, it's trying to get to the root ball or whatever. Lowering your arm just gives you a little bit of breathing room for the fish's next move, but it still keeps enough tension on the line so that you have control over the fish and your hook's not popping out. Okay. So that is skill number 4. Skill number 5, I kept the fish in front of me. When fish get downstream of you, it is really tough to land them because your rod angle completely changes. It goes from putting pressure into the back corner of the fish's jaw to pulling the opposite direction. So the hook can actually work itself free at that point, because if your fish is directly downstream of you and you're pulling on it, the hook point's naturally going to work itself to pointing back towards you. And it's going to pop right out of the mouth, because at that point, okay, pointing directly back towards you is out of the fish's mouth. If the fish is upstream, it's pointing directly into the fish's mouth. So as much as possible, try to keep those fish above you during the fight. When this fish ran downstream on me during that fight, it ran into the pool. It made that run straight at me. I actually stepped out into the pool a little bit to try and spook it back upstream, and that worked. I didn't want it running downstream on me because downstream of that pool was a bunch more riffles, and I knew if it got into those riffles, it was very likely that I was going to go ahead and lose the fish. So I tried to corral it and let it go back upstream, because when the fish are upstream of you, it's just so much easier to control them. The hooks stay in better. That's the angle and the pressure you want, is the fish being upstream of you and then working it down to you. If it's level with you too, that's not terrible. But once they get downstream of you is when it can get really tough to get them in. And skill number 6 is netting it head first. What I did is I used the rod to lift the fish's head as high as I possibly could. Because if you try to net the fish when they're still a few feet underwater, you're probably going to go ahead and bump the fish, or you're going to bump the leader with your net, because they've got a lot of control. Their head's down. They can move however they want. It's very similar actually to dogs, where when the dogs dip their heads and they get their heads below their shoulders, they've got a lot of pulling power. They can really move you around, and it's surprising how such a small dog can sometimes bully you a little bit. So it's the same thing with fish. When their head's down, they've got all their strength. They can really work it. So if you lift that head up, you have the advantage over the fish. And then if you can sneak your net in right underneath the head and then just lift with the net, boom, fish is in the net. You've caught it. Congratulate yourself. Open your Diet Coke, grab your emergency celebration wings that we all keep in our packs, and celebrate, because you just caught a fish, and it is worth celebrating. Okay. So make sure, and then, just a few other things, make sure you keep the fish wet, work the hook out quickly, let it go. And then you've just successfully hooked and landed a nice trout with these 6 skills. It really, you break it down to just utilizing these things, keep tension on the line, use good angles. Don't let the fish get downstream of you. It really is very simple. It sounds like a lot, but when you just pull these principles out and apply them, you're going to be in great shape. And the last thing I really want to emphasize here is that you're going to lose fish as you go through this and as you learn. That's part of the learning process. I can't tell you how many big fish I lost that just completely kicked my butt because I let them get downstream of me, or I didn't have enough tension on the line, or they jumped and I jerked on the rod. Whatever it is, I made plenty of mistakes, and I still make them. Okay, just because I can go through and tell you what to do doesn't mean I'm perfect at it. I still lose plenty of big fish. We've got a lot of footage of me losing fish in our videos. So if you don't believe me, you can go check out the rest of what we've got on YouTube, and you'll see me losing fish. It is not a rare occurrence. But the more that you do it, the more practice you get with it, the better you're going to be at it. It's just something that you've really got to dial in. And the more big fish you get into, you will develop your own fighting style, your own sense of the best way to get them in the net. So just make sure that you go out and experience it as much as possible so you can start building that muscle memory. And that is going to wrap up the open of the show this week. If you've got any other fish fighting tips or questions about anything that we talked about today, go ahead and drop those in the comments. But we're going to move on to the Q&A section for this week's show. Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from listeners and viewers just like yourself. So if you've got a fly fishing question that you would like answered, you can go ahead and send those in. There's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you're watching the video podcast. Our first question comes to us this week from Frank from New Jersey, who writes in and says, "Hi, Spencer, very new to fly fishing. I just bought a fly rod on a visit to the Catskills a few weeks ago. I've been doing research, reading books, and listening to your podcast since. Tons of good information, so thank you for that. I am planning a trip to Colorado this coming May. I've heard you poke fun at fly fishing in Colorado a few times. I will be there for other business, and I was going to plan a guided trip while I was there. After doing some research, I found guides that fish on private waters as well as public. My question is one better than the other? This will be my first time going on a guided trip. I'm hoping to learn a lot as well as catch fish." Hey, Frank, thank you so much. And I poke fun at Colorado. There's always going to be a nice little rivalry between Colorado and Wyoming anyways. And that Wyoming's where I live. But as a rule, Colorado is a little bit more crowded when it comes to fly fishing than some of the other Western states. So there's that. And then Colorado does have a reputation for fish that love small flies. But there is some amazing fishing there. Okay. It's a great place. It's got its quirks, just like every other state out there. Wyoming, the wind's going to blow you off every afternoon. You're going to deal with it, right? Utah, crowds. And then, I could do an entire episode on Utah since I grew up there, about all the quirks with that place, but that's not what you asked. So yes, I poke fun at Colorado, but it's all in good faith because we've all got our quirks, right? So as a rule, your private water is going to be a lot less crowded. So that's a big appeal over public water. If you want a lot of solitude, you don't want other people around, your private water is going to be a great option because you'll probably be the only person on that stretch of the river that day. But with private water, you're not just paying for the guide. There's usually some sort of rod fee that you've got to pay as well. So that might not be baked into the guide's price. You might have to do that separately. So you would want to look at that. It's a bit of an extra expense. A guide, rod fee, and then the tip can add up pretty quick. But that really doesn't matter because where you're fishing, especially for your first guided trip, really doesn't matter at all. What matters is who you're fishing with, what guide you pick. Because you sound like you're great at doing research already, which is really going to help because what you want is you want a guide who is able to tailor the trip to your wants, to your needs. A lot of guides, unfortunately, they've got this mindset of, well, we're going to stuff as many trout in the net as we possibly can today because a lot of clients, that's what they want. It's not always really good for the fishery, especially if you're not fishing different sections of the river every day. It can really wear the fish out. But when the focus is on catching as many fish as possible, usually means you're just dredging nymphs deep. Sometimes it'll be dry fly fishing, but usually it's just dredge nymphs as deep as you can, catch as many fish as you can, keep the clients happy. A bent rod is a happy client, all that stuff. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with dredging nymphs deep. But from a learning perspective, it's only one technique, only one approach that you've learned. And it's a pretty narrow way to do it. Okay. Whereas the best guides are the ones who will tailor a trip to what you want. So as a beginner, you probably want some help with casting. You probably want some help with reading water and fly selection, and then obviously catching fish. You want that as well. A good guide is going to put a day together that does all of that for you. And you're most likely going to end up coming away with a lot of great information that you can continue to apply and hone on your own. And that can be very helpful. So I would worry a lot more about finding a great guide and then going with them wherever they operate. Public versus private water isn't going to matter at all in this sense. Is this guide going to deliver the experience that I want? Am I going to learn from them the way that I want to learn? And this is what I did when I guided. I would put trips together for the people. If they were completely brand new beginners, we started with casting practice, and then we would move into, I'd show them the knots, we'd tie their flies on, and then we'd go and we'd try and catch fish until lunch. Then we'd take a lunch break, and then it was back to it, and that's when I'd try to work on refining things. I'd add a dropper to the dry fly if we needed, or I'd tweak things a little bit. I'd show them a few other things, but the morning was, okay, get them casting, show them where to put the flies, and then try and get a few fish on before lunch. And that was a very good cadence to work through with folks. I'm not sitting here saying I was the best guide ever, because I certainly was not. We got a lot of room to grow in that area, but I did feel like I was able to put together trips that met the needs of the clients. And that's the kind of guide you want to go spend your time and your money with. So hopefully that helps. I appreciate the question. Thank you so much. Rusty from South Carolina has got our next question, writes in and says, "Thank you guys for your enthusiasm and knowledge in this chess match we play with trout. When I run a dry dropper rig at our mountain rivers, it sometimes looks like my dropper is creating drag on my top fly rather than from my top line. My thought is the current is pulling on the midge or nymph, causing unnatural drag on the top fly. Perhaps too much weight or length of subsurface tippet could contribute, as well as the bottom. Is either fly really drifting naturally? How can I improve on my dry dropper rig presentation if I'm searching? Rusty, this is an interesting question. Thank you for sending this in. Without fishing with you, it's hard for me to diagnose exactly what the problem might be, but based on your description, what I think is happening is that your dropper is dragging on the bottom just a little bit. So what's happening is it's hanging up on on rocks and weeds and sticks, whatever else is down there, and it's just doing that just enough to make it look like your dry fly is dragging, or it's stopping your dry fly for a minute before the current pushes it free of the snag. Because a dropper shouldn't be pulling on your dry fly in a weird way, because usually that dropper is directly underneath your dry fly. So that means they're drifting in the same current at that point. So there really shouldn't be any weird drag like that. It's really rare in my experience for there to be some kind of microcurrent that only impacts your dropper. Now, I would say it's also possible that you're landing your dry fly and your dropper not in the same speed of water. They're landing in two separate currents. So your dry might land off to the left where it's slower, and your dropper might land to the right where it's faster. So that might be pulling it. There could be an issue there. And you will see what you're describing if you land them in opposite currents. But if your cast is good, your presentation's good, and you get those flies to land, dry fly first, and then the nymph lands right behind it, they should be in that same current. So at that point, it's probably the bottom that's causing some of the issues. So I think this is more likely a case of your dropper just catching slightly on the bottom during the drift, in which case it's really easy. You just shorten your dropper by a couple inches and you're in great shape. Or you could go with a slightly lighter nymph as well. If you want to keep the same length but don't want it down as far, go with a slightly lighter nymph. The other possibility is that your fly is dragging, even though you don't think it is. And this might be the most likely as well. Again, without fishing with you, it's hard to tell. But if your dropper is catching on bottom frequently enough for you to think there's something wrong with the drift, your dry is going to start dip and dunk like it's being eaten by a fish. And that's a pretty obvious problem. He didn't describe that in the question. So I think you might just end up having some drag on that dry fly. The more we troubleshoot and work through this, that's what I'm thinking. So if that's the case, you want to make sure, and this goes back to what I said at the very beginning, you want to make sure that you're landing your fly, your leader, and your tippet all in that same current. You want them moving at the same speed, in the same piece of water. Because if not, when they're all going different speeds, that's when you run into the drag problems. And you have to start mending, or you got to start doing other things to mitigate that. Especially on these small mountain streams, you might not even be able to mend. So you probably need to high stick. And all high sticking is once you make your cast, you lift your rod tip really high, and that pulls your fly line and almost all your leader off the water. So you've only got a couple inches of leader and then your fly touching the water. And that's going to eliminate drag from anything else, from the leader and the line. So that can help eliminate some of this drag if you're seeing it. But that's what I think is most likely. Again, without fishing with you, it's hard to say for sure, but that's what my gut's telling me. So hopefully that helps. And let me know if you got any other questions. Weston from Colorado's got our next question, writes in and says, I have a quick question about double nymph or double dry dropper rigs. I was always taught that the first fly you tie onto your tippet or off the bottom of your dropper should be the larger nymph, with the smaller fly or emerger following beneath that. After listening more to the podcast and researching, I'm wondering if I have this backwards. Should the fly tied higher up in the water column be the emerger or smaller fly with the heavier / bigger fly on the bottom? In the example of a zebra midge and a jujubaitis, should the jujubaitis be tied as the top fly and the zebra midge as the bottom? Thank you for the help with a very specific question. Weston, thank you, because you're giving me the chance to use my favorite phrase on the show. It depends. Generally speaking, yes, you do want your largest nymph first, whether it's a double nymph rig or a dry dropper rig. You want your largest nymph first and then your smallest nymph on the bottom. That makes the rig cast better. That's why we set it up that way. It's cast smoother. The presentation's a little bit better when you set it up that way. But there are times when I will go ahead and stray away from this. I'll give you an example, okay? If we're fishing with a dry dropper setup, I've got my dry fly on, but I want to get an emerger below it because I think that the fish might be suspended a little bit higher. They might be eating that emerger. Yes, even if that emerger is small, I will tie that one on next. So you're correct in thinking that's a good idea. Then if you still want another nymph below that, you want to go dry dropper, then it just goes on beneath that emerger. And if that nymph's bigger than the emerger, it's not wrong. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's going to feel a little bit different during the cast. That's really going to be where you notice it. But there's nothing wrong with setting a rig up like this. The one thing I'll tell you, though, is you can go ahead and fish emergers pretty deep. There's nothing wrong with making them the bottom fly either, because emergers have to start out on the bottom of the river and go all the way up to the top. So there's going to be emergers down at the bottom at some point. So you can always fish that emerger as the last fly in your rig, and sometimes that's the best way to do it, because sometimes that's where most of the emergers are. If there's not a hatch actively going on, you don't see fish suspended up high near the surface, an emerger down on the bottom is a really, really solid choice. Another example, though, of when I would put the heavy fly on the bottom is during the spring or fall when the fish are eating eggs. Now, of course, when fish are eating eggs, it's because there's fish spawning in the rivers, and you never fish to spawning fish. When they're spawning, leave them alone, let them do their thing. You don't step on their nests, which are called redds. You leave the spawning fish alone. But when there's spawning fish in a river, that means eggs are going to be on the menu. There's going to be a lot of eggs drifting down through the water, and fish are going to respond very happily to them. So when you fish the deeper runs and the pools, because fish will spawn in the faster, shallower water. So the deeper runs and pools, that usually won't be spawning fish there. So you're usually you're usually safe to fish that stuff. You can go ahead and fish that stuff with your egg patterns, but often there's also going to be midges or mayflies that are hatching at the same time as spawn's going on. And the fish might not all be keyed in on the eggs. So what you would want in that situation is your egg on the bottom, nice and heavy, so it drops, because that's where eggs are naturally going to drift, and then a midge or a mayfly emerger above that egg, and then your indicator above it. So in that instance, yeah, your heaviest fly is on the bottom, and I fished that way a bunch this spring, actually, during the rainbow spawn on one of our local rivers, and it worked very well. Caught a lot of brown trout that were very happy to eat the rainbow trout eggs as they were drifting through. So bottom line here is that as long as you're rigging up your flies in a way that makes logical sense, there's a reason behind doing it. There's not a right way and a wrong way to rig your flies up. The fish will tell you if you need to change something, okay, but there's not a right or a wrong way that I'm going to sit here and tell you to do something like that. The fish will always tell you, and then you can make changes based on how they react to your rig. So thanks for sending that question in, and that wraps up the Q&A section of the show this week. But don't go anywhere, because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week here at Untangled, we end the show by sharing a story and pictures from folks who are out on the water living real life. We love to hear and see about all the adventures y'all are going on. So definitely keep sending these Live Real Life moments into us. And if you've got a Live Real Life moment you would like to share, there's a link to do that down in the show notes or right here on the screen if you are watching the video podcast. And this week's Live Real Life moment comes to us from Dave. Writes in and says, I'm approaching 60 years old and have been fishing and hunting most of my life. My dad started taking me fishing when I was 7 or 8 and hunting when I was 10. We'd go up north 1 or 2 weekends each spring for fishing, and we'd spend countless hours shooting our bows, scouting for deer, and then bow hunting in the fall. I can't even begin to quantify the number of hours we spent hunting and fishing over the years. He was much more than just a dad. He's also been a mentor and hunting buddy and fishing buddy. I owe my love of the great outdoors to him, and he's taught me so much. Words simply cannot express the appreciation I have for him. I stopped hunting and fishing in my late 30s to spend time with my kids and coaching softball in the spring and soccer in the fall. The kids are all grown, and I started fly fishing 5-6 years ago, and it's allowed me to reconnect with that part of my soul that has been dormant for 20 years. It's been an incredible journey. Dad's 83 now, and his days of hunting and fishing are well behind him. He still enjoys talking of his many trips afield, and I enjoy hearing of them because it brings him back in time. Last spring, he was telling me of some local places that he used to fish. We got in the truck and went for a 2-hour drive so that he could show me some of these places. We chit-chatted about fishing the whole time. Man, it was great. Somewhere along our trip, he commented that he couldn't remember the last time he had had a brookie for dinner and how much he'd enjoy one. Fast forward a month later, I was fishing with a buddy of mine and told him I was going to keep the first one for my dad. First cast on a yellow hornbug resulted in an 11 to 12 inch brookie. We fished all day and lost track of the fish we caught. So it was a great day. I had a smaller 8-inch fish swallow the hook, so I had 2 fish to bring my dad. I got home and told my wife that I was happy to have a couple fish for Dad. Let's just say that she did not share my enthusiasm and was skeptical that Dad would appreciate it as much as I thought he would. Now, my dad has always been a bit on the stoic side and rarely expressed happiness, especially as he got older and the day-to-day tasks have become so difficult. He expresses appreciation, but not really happiness. So I called my dad and put him on speakerphone to tell him I had a couple brookies for him. Spencer, I kid you not, this stoic old fellow was like a giddy kid at Christmas. I could not recall the last time he acted happy, but his reaction was pure joy and happiness. It gave my wife and I both goosebumps. So that is my live real life moment, a lifetime of sharing the outdoors with him, the many memories, and a tiny bit of that paid back by treating my dad to a couple of trout for dinner. Dave, that's awesome. That is so stinking cool. I am honored that you shared that story with us, and that's incredible. You were able to have that kind of connection with your dad in the outdoors. There's really something special about that, and you articulated a lot of that very well. So thank you so much for sharing that and sending it in. I appreciate it. With that, folks, on Dave's wonderful note, we're going to end the show this week. Thank you so much for being here, listening, watching to the whole show. It helps us out more than you realize. If you want to help us out even more, tell all your friends about Untangled. Evangelize the podcast for us, if you will. And make sure you rate and subscribe to us wherever you're listening. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can help live real life. And that's our whole goal here at VFC. That is what we are in business to do, is to help you live real life. So speaking of that, go have some fun. Get out on the water. It's finally starting to cool off. Go catch some fish. And until next week, live real life.